Let's take a quick history lesson as we learn more about the first black person to be admitted to the Florida bar. Henry Harmon was born in Pennsylvania in 1839 and became the first African American to join the bar here in Florida. Here to tell us more about Attorney Harmon is FAMU Law Donor Relations Officer Reginald Mitchell Sr. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us about Henry Harmon's life.
Okay, so he was born in Philadelphia in 1839, and the exact date of his birthday we don't know, and that's the tragedy. But in 1869, he joined the United States Colored Infantry of the Union Army, and that same year he became a sergeant right away. And so he served for about 3 years in the military, but he was stationed in Morris, South Carolina, and Hilton Head, South Carolina. Next thing you know, their troops are stationed in Florida, and so that's how he ended up in Florida, in Tallahassee, Lake City, and ultimately Gainesville.
So what were some of his accomplishments?
His accomplishments were tremendous, and so by serving in the military, he met a lot of powerful friends, right? So Josiah T. Walls, the first U.S. congressman, the black U.S. congressman, was a very good friend of his, and so the Military Reconstruction Act was passed in 1867, so that required the southern states to give suffrage to blacks, and so he ran for office in 1867. Let me go down just a few of the things he was elected to, and this is what's so amazing to me. He is a sort of a Renaissance person that's a cross between Paul Robeson and Adam Clayton Powell. He's just the greatest secret ever told. So in 1867, he was elected Alachua County voter registrar. Then he went on to become a member of the executive committee of Alachua County. Then he became vice president of the convention in Alachua County. Then he was elected to the Florida House of Representatives from 1868 to 1870. So the first assembly, after they have to allow blacks to vote, he becomes a member of the Florida House of Representatives. And he became assistant secretary of the National Negro Labor Convention, Gainesville councilman, and chief clerk of the Florida House of Representatives. And so that's just the stuff he was elected to. Then he was appointed to a lot of fabulous things. Let me go through them real quick. Clerk of the court, he was appointed by Governor Harrison Reed, who became a good friend of his in 1871, clerk of the court. Then he was appointed by President Ulysses Grant to the title of Register of Lands in the Office of Eastern Section of Florida. Then he also became a United States Custom official by President Grant again. Then he left politics and became a principal of Lincoln Academy in Tallahassee, Florida. And finally, he was appointed by the Internal Revenue Collector as U.S. Internal Revenue Deputy Collector. So, I mean, he's got like 9 or 10 titles, and I'd never heard of this guy until I started doing this research.
He's a Renaissance man indeed.
Indeed.
My goodness.
Okay.
So how was he then admitted to the Florida bar?
Okay, so in 1860, I think it was 69, and so he was well connected, big time Republican politician. At the time, if you were a member of a bar in any other state, you could jump in. Eventually, years later, if you went to a law school, you didn't have to take the bar, but he did have to take the bar. And so at the time, the custom was a judge would appoint a committee, they'd evaluate you, and so 2 attorneys were appointed, and they evaluated him, and it was very difficult, as you could imagine, for anybody, even now at that time, but for African Americans, it was especially difficult because of the bias, but he flew through and passed that successfully and became the first black attorney in 1869.
And you're not talking about, this is not that far after the end of official slavery.
Right. And so, and you can imagine, if you know the story, that, yes, there was the Civil War, but once Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president was very friendly to the Southern secessionists, right? So it was not so easy. And then by law, the jury, they had to accept African Americans, but by 10 years later, the Southern Compromise, where they withdrew the federal troops, it became nearly impossible to do the work of African American attorneys. But somehow this guy and others like him, like Josiah Walls and another person, they formed the first black law firm in Florida. So these politically connected, and all African Americans at the time that were public officials were members of the Republican Party. So they worked together and got some things from the federal government standpoint. But eventually, in 1867, that election, 1877, I'm sorry, they took away the rights of African Americans. They started intimidating, actual violence, all of that, just like the Ocoee Massacre, even a bit later in 1920. Those kind of things went on, and then all of our rights started to get taken away.
And you mentioned that he was politically connected and also that he had been appointed by Harrison Reed,
Right.
The governor of
Right.
Florida at the time. What was the nature of their interaction?
Okay, so because they were big-time Republican delegates, Henry Harmon was trying to run for state representative, and he eventually got elected. Haji Walls was picked in that year, 1870, to go for U.S. Congress. Harrison Reed was running for governor, so they were campaigning together in Central Florida. And then all of a sudden, they try and get on this steamship, and they were denied admission. They had to sleep on the deck. They couldn't sleep in the quarters like the regular passengers because they were African American. So Harrison Reed, running for governor, he was friendly to them and met them from the campaign. He sat with them together, sleeping on the deck because it just wasn't the right thing to do to enjoy the comforts in the beds that he was while they were sleeping on the deck. So they stayed together and they stayed connected since that incident.
There was also a famous story that happened on the Ocklawaha
That's it.
Ocklawaha River. What's that story?
That's the river. On that river, on this boat, they were denied admission to sleep in the quarters, and so on that same boat, on that river, is this famous story where they got to know the governor of the state of Florida. So he was a Republican elected governor. They were Republican elected officials eventually, and they all were successful. And then back in 1871, that's when he appointed him to clerk of the court. Wow. So he used his power to appoint who he saw as a good person. And again, Henry Harmon, at 20-something, becomes a sergeant. He was just an outspoken advocate. He was both an author, and he owned about, I think, he was a publisher for about 3 newspapers. And so he just did so many things so well, it was just unbelievable, and he was rewarded. And that, at the time in the South, when Democrats took over in the South, the way they got public positions were through federal appointments when Republicans were in charge, or in this case, Harrison Reed was a Republican governor. And so, but once the Democrats took over again in 1877, that's when all African Americans for many years were removed from a lot of political positions and even in places of employment because the politics had changed.
Reginald, thank you so much for sharing Henry Harmon's story with us.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, inspiring to say the least.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to say is most of us would not know. J. Clay Smith, I think he wrote a book, the former dean of Howard Law School, wrote a book about black legal education and black lawyers. But Darius Young, a professor at Florida A&M University, and I think is QEP director now, he is probably the most prolific author of the story of Henry Harmon. So thanks to him. But if you wanted to find a photograph of this guy, even though his name is on buildings and all these things, you can't find a photo or anything. So I'm going to continue to do that kind of research to find out more and at least get a picture of this great hero of American history.
And likely one of many such stories out there we just don't know.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Henry Harmon was a pioneer, African-American attorney in Florida's Reconstruction era, and despite the challenges and obstacles, Harmon was able to study the law, pass the exam, and raise his hand to be accepted to the Florida bar in Gainesville in 1869. And we appreciate his dedication and service. There's more Legal Connections coming up, so stay with us.